So thanks so much, Aaron. The pronunciation was just, fantastic, and I really appreciate it. I know it's hard. So thanks everyone for being here. It's really a pleasure to share this piece of work, very much work in progress, with you today. So let me say as motivation first. Why am I interested in prenatal exposures? We now know that the prenatal period is highly susceptible to the environment, and given the many critical and sensitive developmental processes that take place during gestation, environmental exposures may have long-lasting consequences for health, development, well-being over the entire life cycle, right? So the problem when we try to understand these phenomena is that exposures, in particular detrimental exposures, are usually correlated, right? If we think about poverty, for instance, what is it that is detrimental? Is it the lack of financial means? It is instability? Is it violence? Is it environmental pollution? And so on and so forth. So given that these events are unfortunately correlated in people's lives, it is challenging for us to isolate and distinguish causal effects. One way we go about trying to do this is using natural experiments, right? So we take these events that occur in the physical or in the social world and that are allocated as random. So say a natural disaster, which I've used in previous work, a sudden economic contraction, a sudden change, a drastic change in policy, we use to try to find sources of exogenous variation, and this is great. But there is always this tension between the internal validity of the natural experiment that we use and its external validity, not just in the narrow sense of which population this applies to, but in a broader sense of which processes are we capturing and which processes are we not capturing when we exploit a natural experiment. So what does a natural experiment tell us, and what are we as social scientists interested in? A natural experiment, the better the natural experiment is, the more it allows us to focus, to isolate the effect of a particular exposure, right? And this is precisely why we use them. But of course, in real social life, there are at least two other things going on. First, people select themselves or are selected by institutional processes into exposure. So when we use a natural experiment, we try to use something that, say, comes unannounced. Say I use an earthquake as a natural experiment for stress. Because it comes unannounced, people cannot select themselves into not being exposed to the earthquake. But in real life, real phenomena, people are able to predict sometimes that something is going to happen and select themselves out of the so-called treatment accordingly, right? And then the other dimension I wanted to highlight today is behavioral responses, right? If people are exposed to something that's likely detrimental, we adjust accordingly. We use strategies that we can to try and minimize the damage that we may experience, right? So, all these three things are constitutive of the outcomes that any exposure, or most environmental exposures, will produce. In our zeal to isolate causal factors, we try to kind of rule out 2 and 3 to focus on 1. And that's great, but what I'm going to do today is to try to move a little more towards trying to kind of embrace, if you will, 2 and 3. This is, of course, going to have limitations. This is not the lab, right? But I'm going to try as much as possible to include all these phenomena in what I'm examining today. What am I examining today? Today, this paper is about, by the way, this is a collaborative work with Andrés Villarreal at the University of Texas, Austin. And what we're interested in is the effect of exposure to local homicides. I'm going to define local as municipal, on birth weight and our birth outcomes actually in Mexico. So first, why exposure to local violence? The exposure to violent crimes and violence in general is actually highly prevalent in contemporary societies, as you know, and is unequally distributed along socioeconomic and racial lines. So this question has, for me, a student of stratification, direct implications for the intergenerational transmission of disadvantage, particularly if we're talking about exposure before birth, right? Why birth weight? Because it's an important predictor of health, development, and attainment throughout the life course. It's this idea that it's a measure of endowment at the starting gate of life. And why Mexico? Because Mexico has experienced a substantial, dramatic, actually, increase in homicide since 2007. This increase is almost entirely driven by drug trade-related violence, right? These are the trends in the Mexican homicide rate since 1990 to 2010, the year for which we have high-quality data at the moment. Actually, 2011 is now it's coming out. And as you can see, there's a gradual decline and then a very drastic increase in the late 2000s, right? A massive increase for international standards in such a short period of time. Let me take a step back for a second and say a word about the historical context of these trends, right? This very drastic increase in crime is somewhat surprising, driven by drug trade-related violence. It's somewhat surprising because Mexico has been a hub for drug traffic into the US for decades. Since at least the early 20th century, and because drug trade organizations have been in business for decades, right? So what happens that explain this? Some researchers claim that the growth and entrenchment of these drug trade organizations took place during the rule of the PRI, the party in power in Mexico, the Partido Revolucionario Institucional, in power in Mexico from 1929 to 2000. These analysts suggest that the people in power not only allowed, but many times profited from drug traffic, right? So there was this, if you will, this relative equilibrium or stability in the relationship between the authorities, the drug traffic organizations, and law enforcement. This relative stability started to fray when the country started to decentralize and when the PRI started losing first local elections in the 90s and then the presidential election in 2000. 2006 actually marks really a watershed moment for this process, because in that year, the newly elected president, Calderon, he launched an really unprecedented crackdown on drug traffic organizations. He sends military troops, thousands of troops, police to the street, to the drug traffic hotspots. The mission was to kill or arrest the drug traffic leaders, the leaders. This strategy, many analysts claim, but this is still debated, but it's rather plausible that this strategy caused quite a bit of fragmentation, splintering, infighting between and within organizations, right? Leaders were being killed, so there's a fight for succession. The traditional routes into the US were dismantled by the authorities, so there is a search to move around to find new routes, and there is this opportunistic behavior and competition for this lucrative business. In this context, violence increased dramatically. First targeted to other criminal drug trade organizations, but then quickly and increasingly targeted at local authorities, journalists, bystanders, people on the streets, basically. And I have to say the nature of these crimes is very particular. These crimes are, because their objective is really to claim territory, to scare others, is really gruesome. It's really horrible crimes with, torture, with hanging corpses. So it's very plausibly a very high, a source of very high stress for the population, exacerbated, by the way, by the constant reporting by the media that depicts in particular the randomness and the normalness of these things, meaning it could happen to you, it could happen to anyone. This is the context I'm going to be analyzing, right? I don't mean to claim, it's ridiculous to claim that what I'm using as the treatment, the increase in violence, is a random blip. This is not the case. What I'm trying to do is to, using the right models and controlling for the right things, to formulate a situation in which the increase in violence at the local level is not expected by the population, given the characteristics I have described, right? This thing happened very quickly, it moved very quickly, it increased very quickly. In fact, the drug traffic leaders, the government, no one really expected this. It came as a surprise when you interview people, to pretty much everyone, this, if you will, unintended consequences of this strategy. In any case, so this is a quick word about the context. In order to assess the effect of local homicides on birth outcomes in Mexico, I'm going to draw on several very important literatures, some of which have really shaped by people in this department, actually. There's a zoological literature on neighborhood effects that shows a strong cross-sectional association between local violence and birth outcomes. That's very well documented. It's all cross-sectional, however, so of course the risk of spuriousness, right, unobserved characteristics of the localities that are also correlated with the outcomes, is possible. But it's a very important literature. In addition, we have a literature from medicine and psychology mostly that suggests maternal stress as a plausible mechanism at the individual level, right? Linking exposure to violence in your locality with birth outcomes. The literature is not fully conclusive, but my reading at least is that most of what we have found suggests that exposures early in the pregnancy are particularly detrimental. The mechanism is, of course, physioendocrine, right? Cortisol and other stress hormones are damaging for the pregnancy. But then there is another literature that highlights behavioral responses by pregnant women as a plausible mechanism, right? And here we find two strands. One strand suggests or indicates that stress may induce health-depressing coping respondents by everyone, but in this case by pregnant women. Responses such as smoking, drinking, reducing prenatal care, and so on and so forth. So this behavioral mechanism would result in worse birth outcomes, right? There's, however, an alternative body of research that suggests that stress and risk perception among pregnant women may induce precisely the opposite, health-enhancing behaviors to protect the pregnancy, because I realize that my environment is becoming insecure. I do what I can to protect my pregnancy. And there's this notion of altruistic fear and so on and so forth offered by the literature, such as, for instance, using more prenatal care. So this, of course, poses the question, well, when is exposure to violence likely to produce health-enhancing versus health-depressing responses? Can we formulate a hypothesis about a systematic association? And actually, psychologists have formulated one. This is, a very well-established hypothesis that Actually, they call it a law because it has a lot of credence. This is an inverted U relationship between perceived risk and stress by the pregnant woman in this case and her performance. And this is, by the way, it's called the Yerkes-Dodson hypothesis or law, formulated as early as in the early 20th century. The idea behind this inverted U formulation is that at low and at very high levels of perceived risk and stress, your response is not optimal. The idea is low levels of stress don't provide sufficient motivation to act and to try to prevent the damage. Very high levels of stress really overwhelm the system, and people focus on reducing anxiety rather than addressing the threat, right? So it is, according to this hypothesis, moderate levels of stress and risk perception that may induce you to engage in health-enhancing behaviors. So this is certainly a possibility. We don't know much about the plausibility of this in the context of responses to violence. For some reason, researchers appear to tend to kind of embrace either one or the other, or maybe it's just that there's no evidence for both in the mind of each particular paper. But there's no much evidence in literature suggesting that the relationship may be severely nonlinear, that makes sense. And that, of course, makes us pay attention to the question about the heterogeneity of the effect and the potential responses, right? It's rather plausible that people with different levels of resources of advantage react differently to an event such as exposure to violence. So, okay, but I've talked about the direct effect of violence via stress, the indirect effect, if you will, via behavioral responses. I have said nothing about selectivity, which I introduced. This is relevant for what we are studying here because there may be selection of the population at risk of experiencing local violence, right? There might be preemptive behavioral responses. Violence, again, is not a random blip. As you know, it occurs sometimes in cycles, right? This metaphor of cycles of violence. And people may predict that things can get increasingly worse and react with preemptive behavioral adaptations. The most important ones when we talk about birth outcomes are, of course, fertility, reproductive choices, and migration. There are others, but these are kind of the usual suspects, very clear usual suspects. Again, if these responses are heterogeneous across the population, they may induce selectivity by altering the composition of pregnant women exposed to violence. That is what you get to observe. Okay, so with this in hand, let me move to the actual analysis. Feel free to interrupt at any, this is not, I don't know what the culture is, but feel free to just interrupt at any point. Okay, so with this in hand, let me formulate a bit more systematically our research questions, right? First is the question about exposure, of course. What is the effect of exposure to local homicides on birth weight, right? This is, of course, a reduced form effect that I'm capturing here. And the second question that matters to us, because it's very plausible that there is heterogeneity and because we're particularly interested in the heterogeneity as it relates to socioeconomic advantage, is whether this effect is heterogeneous across the population and what the implications of that are. But then I said I started this talk distinguishing these three related phenomena. So the question about behavioral responses are, does the exposure to local homicide alter health-related behaviors, which may in turn affect birth outcomes, and this modification can in principle be towards health enhancing or health decreasing behaviors. I'm going to focus on today, I'm going to focus on prenatal care utilization. I'm going to focus on this because substantively prenatal care utilization has been shown to net of selectivity, of course, to have a beneficial effect on birth outcomes in developing countries, particularly in Mexico, even more than in the industrialized world, to the extent that we have, that we can deal with the selectivity issue. So it's an important potential mechanism. And to be quite frank, because I have very good quality data on this, and unfortunately I don't have data on other maternal behaviors that may matter. So, and
are you distinguishing between drug-related homicides and non-drug-related homicides?
Yeah, well, actually, since, let me save this for the next slide. And I'm going to explain a little bit what my treatment is. But thanks, this is really relevant. So, and again, the question about heterogeneity comes here. Again, are these behavioral responses heterogeneous across the population of pregnant women? And finally, I'm going to also try and address as best as possible, given the data we have, the question about selection, in particular, does exposure to local homicides affect fertility or migration decisions that would alter the population at risk of experiencing violence, right, at the local level. So here I'm going to introduce the analytical strategy, and I'm going to address your question. So what we do is we construct a monthly panel of municipalities by merging birth records, birth certificate information, which contain information on birth weight, gestational age, characteristics of the mom and the newborn. We're merging that information with homicide data at the municipal level. So we have all homicides at the municipal level for these 3 years. That would be 36 months, of course, right? Because it's a monthly panel, right? To your question, we could use several sources of homicide data. The two that make more sense are total homicides as coded by the International Classification of Disease, coming from the Mexican Bureau of the Census, right? We could have used also a data set that has been created by the Secretary of Public Security in Mexico that counts the number of homicides presumably due to drug traffic related violence, right? There's a lot of controversy about those data. Some people say that they underestimate, it's based on local authorities collecting the data, and the qualities in question. And given that we are, as I'm going to explain in a bit more detail in a second, we're using, our treatment is the change in homicide rate from 1 month to the next, and most of the change occur via drug traffic-related homicides. Using all homicides is not a terrible problem. In any case, we created both data sets, we did it both ways, nothing changes at all. I'm presenting now, however, what we did with all homicides, but if someone is curious, I have all the tables for the other formulation. How I said I introduced the intuition of this a little bit, but let me say it a little bit more formally. Our strategy is to use municipality and month fixed effects models, right, to account for any time invariant and observe heterogeneity across municipalities and over time. To examine the effect of municipal homicide rate on birth outcomes. The way we do it is the homicide rate is 1 homicide per 1,000 population. I'm going to talk a bit more about this metric. It matters for when we try to assess the magnitude of the effects. Yes? These are similar to counties, a little bit smaller in size than counties. So it's a exhaustive and mutually exclusive administrative division of the country. And there's 2,500, give or take, municipalities in Mexico. Yeah, so they're larger than census tracts. It's the smallest area we could have used. Ideally, like if I was the queen of this, I would have used neighborhood, something closer to neighborhood, right? Or even better, I would use like a measure of distance from residence to the occurrence of the homicide, right? A measure actually of social distance, not just, you know, physical distance. But, well, that wasn't quite possible. Maybe for a smaller study of, you know, a city or something, we're moving towards that. But in any case, but of course, fixed effects account only, municipality fixed effects account only for time invariant sources of unobserved heterogeneity. And violence is correlated with other things that matter to people. There is this substantial literature that shows the correlation, the co-occurrence of increases in violence with economic disruption, right? Unemployment, these things. So we also control for potentially spurious time-varying factors as much as we could by merging data from different surveys. So we control for trends in the unemployment rate, wage levels, a measure of economic well-being, and labor force participation of both men and women. Very important. These are pregnant women, people who would we claim are affected by local violence. So this is about the setup. Let me finally move to the results. So I'm going to proceed in steps. This is we're predicting here birth weight, right? We're predicting birth weight, and the first model, model 1, includes all models. I'm not showing the controls for the trends, right? Because the table, or much less the fixed effects that would. So the first model includes, in addition to those, it includes the homicide rate that the woman experienced in her municipality in the third, second, and first trimester of gestation. The reason is, as I mentioned, that the timing of exposure, according to research from psychology and economics and such, matters, right? So I want to capture that. As you can see, what we find is a positive effect of exposure to local homicides in the first trimester of gestation on birth weight by around 40 grams. This is really unexpected, right? I mean, I came into this research thinking that, as I had for other research, and if the mechanism is stress, then this effect should be negative, of course. But I'm getting a positive effect. Yeah? Right. Exactly. I mean, positive selectivity of those, the traditional calling of the weakest hypothesis, right? So positive selectivity of live births. We did, as one of the research checks, we did the analysis of fetal deaths. We didn't find anything at all, which is, to be honest with you, not fully satisfactory, because if pregnancies are lost very early, you wouldn't even not even the woman would know, right? But we also analyzed the effect of homicide exposure on fertility rate, right? And we didn't find any effect at all either. So to the extent we can test this doesn't seem to be a plausible hypothesis, although it's a very important point. So we have a positive effect, which is really puzzling. Well, let's do a couple more things before we examine this. So then we're going to control for exposure to homicides before conception. So if there's any selectivity associated with your exposure pre-conception, this parameter estimate would capture, we wouldn't know exactly what is going on, but we would capture that. We tried, of course, with several formulations, 2 trimesters, 3, and so on and so forth. Nothing changes much. So we keep having a positive effect of about 40 grams. We control for the usual suspects, no change at all. This is very surprising. Before moving on, let me repeat the exercise by using now the probability of low birth weight, right? Low birth weight are births that weigh less than 2,500 grams. They're at highest risk of developmental health and so on outcomes, so it's relevant. As you see, the effect is negative, which means increasing the homicide rate induces a decline in the probability of low weight. This is, let's take a second to think about the substantive magnitude. This is not altogether negligible. If you see, the baseline is about 6.6% of births are low weight. This is a decline of 1.1 percentage points. Not irrelevant. We're talking about 16%, but it's of course insignificant. I'm just saying this FYI. I cannot make much of this. What I'm going to say, however, is that very recent research claims that this exclusive focus on 2,500 grams as a definition of babies most at risk is unwarranted because babies that weigh a little bit over that are also compromised in terms of later outcomes. Let me finish this and I'm going to. So we tried less than 3,000 grams and we got a substantial negative, which means beneficial effect, right? Look, I don't want to make a whole lot of this. These are all arbitrary cutoffs. We have done this addressing the change in the distribution of birth weight. Wilcox. There's techniques to do it better. The effect is pretty much consistent with this, which is there is a beneficial effect, and it varies a little bit across cutoffs and such, right? Yes?
Would you compare baseline during the mom and then kids during the pregnancy? If mom is insecure, she may be less likely to move. Maybe there may be effect first day of baby.
Oh, okay. This is all very, very important point. First, it was about the first thing you said is poverty. Body weight. Okay. No, we can't. Maybe most of the things you're going to ask about, we can't. Baseline body weight shouldn't be a problem unless there is an association between body weight and exposure to violence, right? Which is in the first trimester of gestation, which is rather unlikely. I cannot think of a good cause for that. Second point you're making is talks about a plausible mediator. That's what you have in mind. Exposure to violence changes your behaviors, as I just explained, because you cope with the anxiety and say you drink more, to give you an example, or because you see that there are risks around it, so you use more prenatal care to try to deal with it, to protect the pregnancy. In your particular example, we didn't have this. These are birth records. We didn't have, birth records don't have, unfortunately, physical activity or many plausible, relevant, interesting mediators, which I would love to empirically explore. We do have, like I said, good information on prenatal care utilization. That's why I'm starting this question about potential mechanisms using that. Yeah. No, we don't. We don't know if there was migration. Then we do an analysis to account for potential migration as a result of exposure to violence, but using we have to draw on the census and do, juggle several things. But in this data, we don't. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Right.
So
right.
You would sort of have to integrate over 3 trimesters, and would it still be significant if you did that?
Yeah, that's true. So you have the standard issue of autocorrelation, right? In alternative models, we include different ways of accounting for autocorrelation. Nothing changes much. I'm still not completely comfortable with what we have done so far, because when we do that, we of course have to cluster standard errors at the municipality level and use robust standards. And when we account for autocorrelation, we cannot do clustering properly. So it's not the final word. So far, there's no change at all. Then I don't know if you're asking this, but then you could include one of these variables at a time, right? And see what happens. For the whole pregnancy. For the whole pregnancy. Well, we can do that as a rather indirect test, I suppose, of what you are after. But it could be possible. Yeah. I think there are more direct ways to capture these problems of, standard problems of autocorrelation. But that's certainly a possibility. Yes. I'm rather interested, actually, in the timing of exposure, because we now know that the mechanisms driving effects of exposures occurring that occur at different points of the pregnancy are different. So I'm kind of after that, but that's a good point, and it's certainly doable. So we have this surprising positive effect. I need to know what could be going on. In order to but before I get to that, let me say a word. So this is just summarizes what I just told you, but graphically, right? So a positive effect on birth weight by about 40 grams, a negative, that means a beneficial effect, a decline on low birth weight that is not significant, but is significant if we use the less than 3,000 gram threshold, right? Before moving on with this question about what could be going on, let me say a word about the substantive relevance of the effects that we just found. This is, in my view, a very important question, because this effect might be significant but completely irrelevant. We don't want to waste time or much less money into this. So we did a bit of a benchmarking exercise to get a sense. Bottom line, the increase in the homicide rate of 1 per 1,000 population during the first trimester of gestation results in a net increase in birth weight of around 37 grams, right? Note first that this is an intent to treat, right? This is a reduced form effect. In which sense? In the sense that we're measuring it among the entire population of women, not among the women who were actually affected by the increase in the homicide rate. Why don't we, measure it among the women affected? That is the first stage, because we don't know. Right? So the best we can do is this intent to treat, but as you know, an intent to treat is at least of a similar magnitude, and reason would suggest usually smaller than an effect of the treatment on the treated, if you were able to select those women, right? So let's benchmark using estimators, ITT estimators. So recent very high quality studies using an ITT estimator find an increase in birth weight by 2.5 grams from the Women and Infant and Children program in the US, and by about 2.5 grams for whites, 4 grams for blacks, as a result of food stamps. This is all in the natural experiment formulation. So compared to these magnitudes, the effect we're finding is huge. Well, this is just, it's huge because of the way I formulated the variable. I formulated as the increase in the homicide rate of 1 per 1,000, right? But only 3.3% of the population, Mexican population, people we care about, experience an increase in homicide rate of 1 per 1,000 population. This is a huge, huge, huge increase. So In order to be more realistic, we can simply adjust the metric of our treatment. Say I divide by 10, and I measure the increase in homicide rate of 1 per 10,000 population. Now this is a lot more realistic, because this increase of 1 per 10,000 was experienced by 17% of the population. This is a big chunk of the Mexican population. We're not talking about this unusual event. Well, and of course, if we change the metric of the treatment, we have to change the metric of the parameter estimate. So this results in an effect of 37 divided by 10, 3.7, which is pretty similar to the ITT effect of this major policy intervention. Using this rough, very rough, a benchmark exercise, my sense is that this is not trivial. This is an effect that matters by calibrating when we use this as reference, right? Okay, but this is just an aside. Let me move to the question. What could be going on that accounts for this very unexpected positive effect? First, this doesn't quite address the question. This is just about the proximate mechanisms. There are two things that two and only two orthogonal determinants of birth weight. If you actually measure them well, they're orthogonal. Weeks of gestation and fetal growth percentile given a particular gestational age, right? Nothing else. Why do I want to distinguish them? Because these two proximate determinants have different etiologies and different consequences. It matters. The difference matters. Well, the answer to what's going on is the increase in birth weight associated with increase in homicides in Mexico is entirely and solely driven by increase in fetal growth. No change in, prematurity, or that doesn't happen. This is actually somewhat relevant because the literature suggests, or actually this is very much a field that is, active, but so far my reading of the literature is that the stress effect, as in the physioendocrine effect of maternal stress, is mostly driven by weeks of gestation. Right? Stress, what stress does is, what the increase in cortisol in the mom, in the placenta, and in the fetus does is to induce early delivery. It doesn't change fetal growth. So this suggests that what's going on in Mexico is not just the effect of physioendocrine stress, that there's something else that will claim maybe behavioral mechanisms, as is highlighted here. So what could it be? Well, I'm going to focus on, for the reasons I gave, on prenatal care utilization, right? I have three measures of the use of prenatal care. First, in the first diagram to your left, is whether or not the woman used prenatal care at all, nothing else. This has not much discriminatory power because in Mexico, as many as 97% of women do have some contact with the healthcare system. So, it's a beginning. Then the other two standard measures in the literature, or two of the standard measures in the literature, are the number of prenatal visits and early initiation of prenatal care. So let's see if the increase in local violence affects this behavioral mechanism. Well, the answer is yes. This is actually, the y-axis, I went all the way to 25%. It's a little ridiculous, but the increase in the proportion of women who respond to increase in local homicides by using prenatal care is about 2%. This is not minor at all. It's a substantial increase, right? Particularly if we consider that 97% of women do use prenatal care already. Prenatal visits, no substantial effect, and early initiation, a rather large effect, 4% increase, 4% of women. So this offers a plausible mechanism. It's rather likely, it's rather reasonable to think that this behavioral response is heterogeneous across the population. So what I'm going to measure next is there variation across socioeconomic advantage of the woman? So we created three groups: low SES women, middle, and high SES women, combining education, marital status, where the woman has access to health insurance. And indeed, what you find is a rather clear, a clear pattern of heterogeneity, right? Whereby it is the most disadvantaged women, the ones who react to local violence by using more prenatal care. Well, here, this doesn't tell you much, because these more advantaged women, most likely they always use prenatal care anyway. But these two do vary substantially. And you have a very clear gradient in which it is more disadvantaged women, the ones who decide to increase their prenatal care, or who do increase their prenatal care as a result of local violence. Here we have the same pattern. Then I do the same for urban and rural residents, and we have that is actually urban women, the one who respond to violence by increasing prenatal care. This makes sense, I think. It's if disadvantaged women are or feel more vulnerable to the violence, right? Because they're closer, they have less protection. But at the same time, your use of prenatal care depends on availability, and availability is much more prevalent in urban settings. So it is plausible. Well, this is indicating that it's plausible that disadvantaged urban women are the ones who respond the more strongly. And this is this group, right? Urban and low SES women, the response is substantially higher. Yeah?
So I want to follow up on that point about availability. You characterized the increase in homicide rates as being a direct response to policy changes by local and national government leaders in terms of how they're responding to drug trafficking. And so I'm wondering whether correlated with that is also a political shift in priorities around low-income women's health care, and whether there is a simultaneous increase in availability.
Right, right. Exactly. That's certainly plausible. I don't have macro data on trends. What we did is, and mostly my co-author actually, who knows the Mexican context very well, we talked actually with public health officials in many places. They couldn't report anything that was systematic. We should push this further. It's a very plausible hypothesis. I don't have any evidence to support this at the moment. So we have that the increase in the use of prenatal care, conditional on availability, provides a plausible mechanism for the effect, for the surprising positive effect that we found, right? Well, what can we do to test this empirically? We now know that we cannot just so-called control for the mediator, right? That these structural parameters for direct and indirect effect, the way we kind of did it with the structural equation approach, are not necessarily similar to the parameters from a causal model, which is what we care about, right? Or in other words, that just controlling for a post-treatment variable, in this case the use of prenatal care, may provide, most likely in this case, given that the sequential ignorability. If someone is interested in the details, we can certainly talk about. For now, it's very likely that in this particular case, just controlling for the mediator provides a misleading answer in terms of the potential outcomes, which is the quantities we're really causal, quantities that we're really interested in. So even if we cannot so-called control for the mediator, it is reasonable to think that if the use of healthcare is indeed a plausible mechanism, then we should find, for the effect of the violence on birth weight, we should find the same pattern of effect, the same type of heterogeneity than we're finding here, right? That is just a reasonable assumption, although it doesn't quite prove the point yet. So that's what we do. We check heterogeneity in the treatment effect for birth weight, right? You saw this already. This is the 40 grams, about 37 to 40 grams, the effect of exposure to local violence in the first trimester of gestation on birth weight for all women. Let's see what happens when we stratify by SES. We find a rather similar pattern of effects in which there is a pronounced gradient. Well, here this is this largely overlaps, so I'm overdoing the point, right? But the effect is stronger among low SES women, exactly the same as we found for the effect in the use of prenatal care. Then we do urban-rural. We have the same pattern. And then we do the same. It seems that it's low SES, but urban women, the ones that respond the most in terms of the use of prenatal care, and also very clearly in terms of the effect on birth weight. As you can see, these standard errors, these confidence intervals, there's a lot of overlap. I cannot overdo these, but consider for a second that I'm using a model that is extremely inefficient, right? I'm using fixed effects by municipality, by year. Everything is as it should be, clustered at the standard errors are clustered at the municipality level. I'm including a bunch of time-varying covariates, so I'm asking a lot of my data, and the patterns of effect are at least, I would say, very suggestive. What happens with low birth weight? Remember, negative means better, lower birth weight. We find pretty much the same, except nothing is significant except for urban women and low SES urban women. So what I want to suggest to you is that this analysis suggests that the positive effect, the surprising positive effect that we are finding in the Mexican context of local violence on birth weight might be mediated by health-enhancing mechanisms, which is rather consistent with these Yerke dots and this inverted U hypothesis. If it's true that for many women, the increase in violence, what it did was to increase perceived risk and induce these adaptations to protect their pregnancy, given availability of institutional availability that would be in urban settings. This is just a suggestion, a strong suggestion. We did a bunch of things to measure selection. I'm gonna tell you we didn't find anything. Selection into fertility, we didn't find heterogeneity. Then we did migration, we didn't find much. We did several versions of migration, intermunicipality, out of the country and such. Well, we did probing mechanisms, robustness checks. I'm going to skip all that just to conclude and have a little time for more discussion. So in sum, exposure to local homicides early in the pregnancy results in an increase, surprising increase in birth weight driven by fetal growth. Actually, the positive effect of prenatal care utilization is rather strong on fetal, as strong or more strong on fetal growth than on preterm birth, as strong. So this is a further evidence that's consistent with the mechanism I'm suggesting. The effect is heterogeneous across the population, strongest among disadvantaged women living in urban areas. There's no evidence of preemptive migration or fertility reactions shaping the population at risk of exposure, but women in particular, disadvantaged women, appear to respond to increased risk by increasing the use of prenatal care, subject to availability constraints. Before I, enthusiastically claim that we should increase access to prenatal care, although I think that's a very worthwhile goal, let me say that the evidence about prenatal care as a mechanism is certainly not conclusive. None of this research is not conclusive, right? But in particular here, it's rather plausible that there are other health-enhancing behavioral changes that the woman engage in that are highly correlated with prenatal care utilization, and I cannot measure, right? So I cannot jump to a policy implication from this, although it's an interesting hypothesis for further investigation. All right, thanks.